Hello. Hello and welcome, because clearly my other thing didn't work. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to figure out what happened to all my stuff. But while it's coming up, I just wanted to say thank you to, this is, by the way, going to be my second last episode for the season. So thank you for just supporting us for all this while for season 2 of Cloud Security Podcast. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to our two sponsors, Exonius as well as Bridge Crew. This would not have been possible without you guys. And I just wanted to say Exonius does a better job of this. So let me just bring them on.
Hey, Ashish and Cloud Security.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are live as this is the main event you've all been waiting for. Brought to you by Exonius, the cybersecurity asset management company. It's time!
Hey, Cloud Security Podcast. Steve from Bridge Crew here. Check us out to start scanning your infrastructure's code against hundreds of security policies, both on the command line and in your IDE. Bridge Crew also adds security feedback to all your commits and helps you fix misconfigurations in both code and runtime.
Awesome. So welcome again. And this is going to be the potentially last episode for the season, so season 2. And I have a really interesting topic for you guys about serverless security. We're going to try and aim into what it could be like in 2022. And seems like definitely serverless has been the top of mind for a lot of people. And you guys have been asking, and we have answered. So in the last couple of episodes of the serverless month that we're doing here on Cloud Security Podcast. And for this, I have someone special. By the way, if you are here for the first time, and if you're watching this on YouTube or LinkedIn, feel free to follow. We do this episodes like this every weekend, and we will be back again on season 3 in January again. But feel free to hop around the YouTube channel. This YouTube channel has videos with chapters for each question we ask to the guest after we go live, and we go live stream every weekend. Cool. All right. Let me bring my guest on because I think you guys are interested in this as well. Let me get into this. Hey, thanks for coming in, Andrew. How's it going, man?
Hey, it's going real good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Not a problem. And I'm so glad I brought in. By the way, thanks for sharing the coffee with me, man. I need to talk to people about their coffee love. Actually, tell me about the coffee you're having, because I think people should know about this as well.
Yeah, so today I'm having a cup of the Case Coffee Epiphany, which is it's a local coffee roaster here in the area that I'm in. I brewed it in my small Chemex here, so really serious about the coffee. But this actually is a really special roast for me because this coffee shop is where I sort of decided that I was going to really lean into AWS and do things like incident response automation and open source and all that fun stuff. And it's just a great roast. I think it's available by subscription online, casecoffeeroasters.com. If you just really like to order small batch roasts, they're awesome.
Awesome. So it's probably a good segue into the question about how'd you go into where you are. Maybe we can start with the coffee place if you like, but I'm sure for people who don't know who you are, can you give us a short intro on how you got into cybersecurity or cloud security? Coffee got you into cloud security, I guess.
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know me, my name's Andrew Krug. I'm a security evangelist at Datadog. I came at this role kind of the long way around, I guess you would say. I came up from like traditional data center work and sort of entered the field, I guess, at the tipping point where data centers were turning into virtual machines. And so, believe it or not, I started my career like migrating Novell NetWare VMs into
really
like Windows. Yeah, I was a group-wise administrator for a while, like boots on the ground, like on-prem, and then like fast forward in like 2012 or so, I made kind of a conscious choice to pivot into cloud security because I saw sort of the explosive growth curve in AWS, and it was still pretty early days for them. But then I even went one more step while I was at this coffee shop with a friend of mine, Joel Ferrier. He works at Google now, I think, and we were having a cup of this coffee and talking about incident response automation, how like all the APIs existed, and we could probably do this thing. So that's when we started to kind of work on a couple open source projects under threat response, the GitHub org that we had for a while, Margarita Shotgun and AWS IR, which we presented a few times at reInvent and things. But that was really kind of the path into AWS for me, and I think to some degree for him as well. And it's just been a wild ride since then.
Wow. And to your point, because I think for people who may not know this, but you've actually given a couple of AWS reInvent talks on the whole incident response thing as well in AWS. I don't know if you're coming this year as well, but I'll let you talk about it if you can talk about it. But it's always good to see your talks, because we had Nathan Case as well, who did a talk with ages ago. He was here on the show as well previously.
Yeah, so I am speaking at reInvent again this year.
Oh, you are? Oh, that's awesome.
Ironically, I am speaking with Nathan Case again at reInvent this year.
No surprise there.
The combination seems to be popular. I mean, in the past, I've also spoken with Henrik Johansson, formerly AWS. Now I think he's still with Salesforce. But Nathan and I are going to be talking about something we never talked about before, which is mergers and acquisitions, and like really how to evaluate what you need to do as part of an M&A strategy when you have to grow a business really, really fast.
Wow. Okay. So that I would be definitely interesting at that point, because we haven't touched that topic. So maybe I should bring you both back in for that as well. But that'll be pretty cool. No, thanks for sharing that as well, man. So and Dutch loves the idea that you got into coffee got you into cybersecurity. How many times that happened? Welcome everyone else as well. Welcome Chom. Let's break some stuff. Welcome Vinny and welcome RKB. Thanks for joining, everyone. All right, let's get into this, man. So we spoke about your path into cybersecurity, but we are talking about serverless security and trying to break it, but maybe hopefully help some people build some security around it as well. What does serverless security mean for you? Let's start there first.
So I think we have to start really with how we define serverless, right? And this is a topic that's like really kind of near and dear to me, because I've been talking about serverless security and stuff since like 2017 or so. Really, when we say serverless, oftentimes we mean function as a service, and like that's compute. But like you can put a whole bunch of different things into this like concept that we call serverless, right? You could put spaces in there, anything that's managed. But most of the time, people really mean function as a service. And so for me, that means how do we safeguard the runtime of the function? So like what's happening with the actual sandbox that's running the code, what's happening with the code, and then what's happening with all the stuff that gets the request to that code, whether it's a web thing or a backend thing.
Okay, and to your point, the separation helps you. Like maybe it's a good segue into the whole. What's a building block for it as well, right? Because at your point, serverless security could be a bit confusing for a lot of people, even though front and back end separation there. What's a good place to start building blocks for serverless security?
I think a good starting point is actually just to adopt an opinionated framework, whatever that might be. So there's like serverless framework, for example. For a while there was, a variety of other projects, but like I think serverless framework, serverless.com has kind of emerged as the like clear market leader. AWS serverless application model, but kind of just starting with that framework to build on top of is a good start point. But then you also have to kind of do as much as you can to understand what it is that you're building on top of. So ingress, runtime, execution, and then how that's accessing other things inside of your cloud environment.
Oh, maybe if I zoom out a bit. So you mentioned ingress. Because to your point, serverless can be triggered by an event or could be a web request. So that's where the ingress kind of comes in. What was the other one? Sorry.
It was the actual. How does it access other things inside of the cloud? So either via IAM, it's going to access things inside the cloud, or it's going to access it via the network layer. So what's your boundary around that?
Oh, okay. Oh, actually, see, that's an interesting way to put it, because normally when I talk to people about, hey, what are some of the building blocks? A lot of people go straight to application security. But I love how you put the whole, actually, there's a lot more to serverless than just talking about application security, although that is quite an important component. But I love the fact that you kind of come from a cloud security perspective. And so to your point, ingress, what's connectivity? So maybe if you talk to a database or any other function, And you mentioned storage. But so to your point, a good starting point then is almost to do an asset inventory of, hey, what else does Lambda function or whatever you have serverless talking to.
Yeah, I'd even simplify it a little bit more, that there's architecture and then there's AppSec. And like, don't get me wrong, like AppSec gets weighted a whole lot more for me on like one side of the scale. But when we talk about this, it has to be a like almost an equal process for like, what's the architecture of the thing that you're running on top of your serverless infrastructure, and then what is the application security strategy, which, believe it or not, is like really, really similar to any application security strategy for anything that you're going to run.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting because, you know, the funny thing is I was going to go break first and then build, but I think we build first. So maybe let's talk about breaking this. Because I saw you had a talk about hacking at B-Sides Portland, I think, ages ago, about hacking serverless. And I don't know if you remember that talk yet, but I think it was really interesting to kind of hear about the perspective you shared on why people assume a lot of abstraction means security, I guess, in the broader scheme of AWS security or Lambda security. Can you know some of your thoughts on breaking Lambda? So I guess we would have two sets of people. We've given them an understanding of, oh, this is kind of what you start. You have architecture, you have AppSec. We've done that. And now let's start peeling some layers of how would you build, say, cracks into these, I guess, let's just say that.
So back in 2017, when we started that project, the Hacking Serverless Runtimes thing, which we presented at B-Sides and Black Hat and even Code Monsters Bulgaria, like if you're familiar with that conference, it's a super fun like Java-focused developer conference, but we did it there. And it was just like super fun to hear all the people who were building on Lambda and things that hadn't really thought about, kind of the potential attack surface, because they just sort of assumed the vendor was doing everything for them. Right?
Mm-hmm.
To assume, kind of assume breach or assume that there were holes to poke in the runtime. And I think we really demonstrated like two clear things in that talk. One of which was that you need to be really, really concerned with how frequently the vendor threw away your container that was executing the code, right? So this idea that you sort of had persistence, but not like really persistence, like you had persistence for like 15 or 20 minutes potentially. Inside of a function if you just kept invoking it over and over again. And then another thing that we demonstrated was this concept of potential vulnerabilities in shared tenancy. So when I say shared tenancy, I mean a whole bunch of functions that are part of the same app doing the same thing. So we built this payment processor app, for example, on top of Azure functions. And we were able to demonstrate that by tricking the runtime, we could get it to decrypt a secret in function B that was only intended to be decrypted in function A, because they hadn't really considered that inside of the security model for computing inside of the same app.
Actually, that's interesting because a lot of people don't even know what runs behind the scene for when they trigger some serverless function. To your point, it's usually a container. And do you know if it's still a container running from the cloud service provider?
So I don't think that we get to know that in every case, right? So every vendor has varying degrees of transparency, and I think this is one of the things that we could improve, and maybe we could riff on a little bit later in the talk here today, but we have to assume it's a container of some kind. Mm-hmm. Whether that's a Zen VM, a Docker container, a Linux container, Firecracker, I don't know that we get to know that. But yeah. It's a container of some kind.
Yeah, because I think to your point, because the whole 5-minute limit that was there, I mean, now you can increase it. That was really interesting because that's what caught my eye about the talk that he did. That 5 minutes there's plenty of time for 5 minutes. I'm like, wait, did this guy just say 5 minutes is plenty of time to get into a serverless container, or a Lambda container in the back?
Yeah. 5 minutes was the original, and now it's 15.
Now it's 15. That's right.
No execution, but that wasn't really the concern. As soon as we figured out that there were sort of persistence behaviors, this idea of like cold starts versus hot containers. And so what we discovered over time as sort of an industry, and I really wish this was one of the places where we had more transparency from our vendors, right, is that for the sake of performance, those containers would never get thrown away if you just kept sort of re-executing in the same container. You got the same warm running container with the same temp partition and things. So you do a lot beyond 15 minutes.
Oh, wait. So if yeah, I think I would definitely encourage people who are listening to this to try and experiment with this. But it's really interesting. So to your point, if I trigger a serverless function and that says create 5 containers in the back, I would continue to work on those the same 5 containers potentially for the duration that I keep triggering the same function. I keep tinkering with it.
Yeah, it's not guaranteed, right? But the goal of the vendor is to provide you as much performance as possible. And the best performance is by not taking that hit from having to spin up a new container and then loading all those dependencies and things into memory sort of dependent on the runtime. So it's almost a behavior that as we lean towards performance for serverless, we can't get away from.
Interesting. Wait, so we've already peeled so many layers onto this, right? So we kind of spoke about the building pieces, then we got into the whole containers running or potentially containers running in the back, and how, well, turning from 5 minutes to 15 minutes, now you have even longer window of just doing what you want to do in that container if you actually had the malicious intent behind you. Actually, I've got a question here from Chad, and actually probably that sums up quite a bit of it as well. Thanks for this, Chad. Least privilege, controlled access, asset inventory. Just trying to decipher the main building blocks myself. Would you concur, or what other main foundational security principles apply before diving deep into trying a secure serverless? That's a good question, Chad. Thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think leaning into all the principles that you normally lean into are great, and I tend to lean into the ones from infosec.mozilla.org, which are sort of a tried and true set of security principles like least privilege, like understand what you're running on, et cetera, as sort of a starting point for evaluating anything. But beyond that, you really have to I think in serverless deep dive into that, understand what it is that you're running on. And I think that's very, very easy in serverless, but often overlooked because the platform is so simple and it's so easy to get up and running with. But then sort of understanding the trade-offs and the drawbacks is something that not everybody is doing.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile calling out though, right? And I'm curious to know your thoughts on, because Chad's question is quite interesting as well, because I think when people talk about serverless, and although yes, serverless from a compute perspective and how it functions is very different, but what you just mentioned, what Chad mentioned as well, the whole idea behind our basic principles of security haven't really changed. We're still looking at, say, identity. That's the least privileged component. Who can do what? And because it's serverless, the serverless function itself can have privileges. How far can that go? And having an asset inventory of how many lambdas or how many serverless functions that are running in the background. So I think that's definitely a great starting point. Controlled access, your storage. So you definitely are riffing on a lot of interesting building blocks over there. Now, which makes you also think when at different levels, because I spoke to a few people who have like thousands of Lambda function, right? And we spoke about some of the building blocks. We spoke about, hey, it's because it was used to be 5 minutes, but it's now 15. But there could be components that are shared across, and I don't think there's much public knowledge around this. There are not many. If I sit there and do a search for serverless security kind of talks, there are not that many talks out there. There are a lot of talks about how they have created an amazing game with it. They've done this, they've done that. And why do you suppose? Like, I think is that because there's not much research in there, and still, even though it's been there at least for 2-3 years, people are still. Adoption is slow?
I think adoption is explosive. Actually, like I think a lot of businesses are running cloud native on top of serverless functions. In fact, I would say it's probably like on par with the adoption curve for something like Kubernetes, but don't quote me on that.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
But if we sort of look at reInvent and like the companies that they're putting on stage, look at where the vendor ecosystem is as far as like observability for serverless. So you have companies like Twistlock, of course, like Datadog, like we have amazing serverless monitoring as well. Like definitely there's an investment there on the industry side as far as like putting more tooling in the hands of customers, and that definitely wouldn't be there if there wasn't this massive adoption curve, because there is a huge incentive, right? And that's ease of development and also like no ops kind of strategies for managing these things. Once you turn them loose, They just sort of go. And I think that's very, very attractive from a business perspective.
And to your point, I think we had someone funny. You mentioned observability as well. We had Ryan come in from Epsagon last week, and we were talking about this very thing around the fact that monitoring serverless is pretty hard as well. And I'm sure the challenges, like monitoring at scale, is a challenge in serverless because you don't know how far the rabbit hole goes for certain serverless functions. I imagine this is the same kind of thing with security as well, where so we spoke about building blocks, we spoke about how to break it, but it's worthwhile definitely touching on how do people approach security in a serverless kind of environment. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think if there's anything that we've learned as a culture, it's that the normal practices that are part of AppSec security is part of serverless security, right? Because you have fewer and fewer facilities to draw on. So it's more important to kind of lean into the things that we know are really, really, just generally kind of best practice. And anything that's good for observability for ops is good for security, right? So when I say that, I'm talking about things that aren't really obvious to security teams, like function execution time or resource consumption combined with some sort of anomaly detection, right? Because if somebody manages, let's say, to exploit your web service API and they can pivot it into a Lambda function, that's going to throw some kind of execution anomaly. Either it's going to be memory consumption, it's going to be like in a tracing graph, there's going to be an impact there that you can detect. And I think those things are kind of what we need to lean into going forward.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of that is, of course, the more obvious, which is the AppSec path, which is like SAST, like software composition analysis, dynamic composition analysis, also things like application logging, which nobody still gets right as an industry. There are teams who are very, very good at it, but just like kind of leaning into good logging strategies to know what the application is doing. Because once it's done executing, it's gone. Like all your forensics, like anything that you could go back and look at, it's gone outside of your logs and your performance monitoring.
That's funny. That's kind of the focus last weekend as well, because to your point, people haven't figured out application logging appropriately. And would you agree that security logs or logging security is not enough for logging the application from a security perspective?
I mean, certainly like logging is one of the things that we can do in a serverless environment that provides a ton of value, but we need other metrics about the environment in order to determine like whether something is actually breached or not breached, right? Because let's say that you get a full RCE in the runtime. You could potentially unpatch or hot patch the actual execution, and you could override some logging. We sort of need to take a belt and suspenders approach. And again, like just leaning into that assume breach mindset, doing some tabletops that are based on how important the service is that you're running. That's part doesn't go away just because you're not building AMIs and running on EC2 or, the like.
Interesting. So I'm glad you kind of brought that up because you definitely have a lot of experience in at least in sharing your experience with the whole incident response kind of thing as well. By the way, Chad just came back saying, thanks, Andrew. Understanding the environment on where these functions are being executed is a great point you made and something I'll research more for sure. Thanks for that, Chad. And glad we could answer your question as well. Feel free to ask any more questions if you have. So I think to your point about AppSec playing an important role into this as well and applying security. So sounds like there are multiple components, and we kind of have summed up from a perspective of there is the CSP side, which is your IAM network and all that. Then there is the AppSec side, and I'm going to use the word DevSecOps here as well. You can use some DevSecOps over there if you want. But from a monitoring perspective, just to kind of respond to your tabletop thing, can you elaborate on this? Like how I think obviously it would depend on the application that people are running. Because it's a whole PaaS. In a PaaS concept, how does like a tabletop incident response thing? What do people have to think about from that perspective?
I think you have to start with a risk assessment, right, and then doing some scenarios, and starting with a maximum impact, maximum risk scenario, right, and then work backwards from that. And your tabletop is going to quickly call out points that you don't have data for necessarily in whatever platform you're logging to. So that could be network, for example. A lot of people don't think about network because these functions are so easy to deploy in like GCP, Azure, and AWS. All the functions deploy in sort of a default hybrid VPC environment that just lets things go to the internet. But if you want to be a little bit more intentional about that, you can deploy those things into a regular VPC, and you can get things like VPC flow logs or like the equivalent of NetFlow data or potentially network taps. And you can have this very rich source of data to help you go back and reconstruct a story for an incident. And it's just sort of taking that same mindset and applying it to every choke point as you work through your application to see if you have the right instrumentation to be able to tell that story after an incident.
Interesting. And I'm so glad you're talking about this as well, because a lot of people would be thinking from a perspective of, great, I've gotten the context of my serverless application. And if I'm trying to break this, what are some of the attack scenarios, or what are some of the attack vectors you can think of for serverless function?
For me, these really fall into two categories. They fall into runtime breaches, and then they fall into actually application breaches that could pivot to runtime breaches. And that we talked about this concept that there's behind-the-scenes serverless, so like effectively processors. So you're using them to like process messages off a queue or something, and then there's like web handlers. So you're using these to build some API, some function that's like present on the web style internet. So the RCE is easy, right? So we assume that like something in the app actually just allows a pivot into the environment itself, like either SSRF, a plain old regular RCE, deserialization vulnerability. Those are all just like regular security stuff that we deal with in any red team scenario. The HTTP ones are a little bit more fun and nuanced, I think, because we're still figuring this out. Like every provider is implementing their own interface or interfaces to serverless functions via some kind of gateway, like API gateway is a great example. And that does or does not build on the learnings of the last like 10 years or so. So like a great example is API gateway's support for content security policy. So we throw around CSP as a term. Usually it means cloud security provider, but in this case, I mean content security policy. So the headers that we send back. API gateway doesn't just have robust support for that out of the box. And a lot of people would say, oh, well, for my JSON API, I probably really don't need that because I'm not serving JavaScript and I'm not serving this and I'm not serving that. But I've seen cases in the past where somebody has exploited a web application and they're able to control content in an error page, for example. And the error page renders HTML, and because it doesn't have the same standard for content security policy, you're able to get a pivot from an error page onto the browser or get it to do something that's unintended. So there's just lots of surface area, I think, that we have to deal with both from a tooling perspective and also an observability perspective to kind of assess, monitor, and keep metrics on the potential attack surface area, right? Because that's the other side of this, is that it is very easy to make microservices. So if you're in a company that is cloud native, always building on serverless, you might have 1,000 microservices, and just even assessing how many of those have content security policies on their error pages, for example, becomes a daunting task.
Interesting. Wait, no one talks about content security policies. So I'm so glad you mentioned, because normally when I talk to, say, AWS or anyone else, or Google Cloud, Azure, a common theme that seems to come out is, hey, you can put a WAF in front of it. And you go, put a CDN, put a WAF, that'll be the end of your problems. You don't have to worry about this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, WAFs are great, and they certainly play a role in a defense in-depth strategy, right? And I think in general, as an industry, we have not leaned into content security policies as we should. So I used to work at Mozilla, right? I worked with April King for a while, who was the creator of the Mozilla Web Observatory, if you're familiar with observatory.mozilla. Just a great tool for scanning for CSPs, but we didn't, just as an org and also for the internet, and April has a great blog article, I think, that she redoes every year on the Alexa top 1 million sites and like how good we're getting as an industry at adopting just general good web security practices, sort of what you as basic hygiene. Like these things are and this is my opinion, and I think it's April's opinion as well, and I'm sure if I'm wrong, she'll tweet at me after this, but I think that teams only adopt these practices if we make it really easy for them to do that, right? So it's a tooling problem as much as it is a security problem. So the more we put good tools in front of dev teams to be able to do this, the higher like adoption curve we're going to have, and the better web security we're going to have in general as an industry. API gateway, CloudFront, and WAF in combination don't make it super easy to do this, right? So as far as I know right now, the blueprint for it, if you want CSP headers, is to do API gateway, maybe you have a WAF in front of that, or maybe you have a WAF in front of CloudFront, and then CloudFront's running something like Lambda at Edge to put those CSP headers in as content is served. So that's a lot of moving parts to just maintain some like basic security hygiene.
Wow. Yeah. Talk about defense in depth, which is complex and complicated at the same time, I guess. Okay. So wait, is it any different in other cloud providers? I don't know if you've worked with other cloud service providers on CSP.
So I have, sort of basically tested out, kicked the tires on all the things, but it varies. I mean, and there's different places that you can sort of bury CSP headers. There's a way to bury them in like the actual like page HTML itself. Like you don't necessarily have to put them in the request response process, but none of it I would call out as like, wow, this was just so easy. It was easy.
Yeah, okay. Right. So, and considering the example that you gave where someone is able to use or exploit an error page to take an advantage, I think, and if someone had said content security policy, right, that would solve the problem. Is that, and I don't want the whole episode, actually, the episode to be about CSP, but for people who don't know what CSP can help with, or is it hard to implement? Is that why people are not implementing it?
So I don't think CSP is hard to implement. I think it's not well known. So I think a lot of traditional like WebSec education tends to focus on the actual application stack itself and not what we're actually doing from a browser side, because for whatever reason, people have this high level of confidence in browser trust, but CSP is still the best tool that we have in the toolbox to ensure that the browser is doing what it's supposed to do in terms of like not allowing like CSRF, et cetera, for embedded untrusted JavaScript, for example. So I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember like MySpace and things, but CSP is basically what shut down everyone is your friend on MySpace due to just like malicious script injection in different posts on somebody's wall on MySpace. And I'm dating myself.
No, well, Andrew, everyone's I'm gonna date myself by my embarrassing stories of MySpace as well. So you're not alone, my friend. But I think it's definitely valuable to talk about CSP from that perspective, because I don't think when a lot of people talk about serverless, they seem to be focused more on AppSec. Hey, there's to your point, do the runtime. Then there is a code part to it. Then there is the I guess the component for the infrastructure, which is in your cloud service provider, which is the IAM networks and all that. And then the other component, which you kind of had touched on, the trigger point, because it's all like, I guess, how are we interacting with the function? And CSP seems to be quite a important one in there. Well, actually, there you go. I was just looking at the comments coming in. So, hey, Martinez, evening from busy, cold London driving, so Nocco.feed loves the stream. Thanks, man. Eye opener. Thanks, Andrew. That was my question going to be. Cool. I'm glad I could ask you a question, man. Yes, old enough to remember. I have a lot of embarrassing stories as well, my friend. You are both real MVPs and both. Thanks, Chad. Cool. So, folks seem to be, by the way, folks, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them as well. Andrew is plenty of help here to unraveling a lot of things which you kind of assume breach. It was the word I was going to use. But so we built on building blocks. We spoke about some of the common attack vectors as well, which includes a trigger point for how your serverless function was triggered. Now, from a maturity scale perspective, right? So to your point, I think Chad did a good thing by kind of summarizing it. And you did as well, spoke about the fact of having a look at the holistic piece of how almost like understand the environment of where your function is running. But we live in a world where, unfortunately, there's a lot of functions in every environment, right? It's not just, to your point, even the background functions. It's like 20, 30, 50, hundreds of functions running in anyone's. So how do we get their head around something like this? Where do maybe if you talk about it from a maturity perspective, how does one start today? Like maybe it's just one Lambda function or one Azure function today, and expand. Is there like a scale that we can kind of look toward benchmarking themselves, or a good way you can recommend for this, for monitoring and maybe responding to this?
I mean, of course, like bringing in some kind of observability, like Datadog has a great serverless monitoring product just to kind of wrap everything under one umbrella where you can see it all in one place. Even if it's not that, projects like Open Tracing and things, or Amazon's X-Ray product allow you to sort of collect telemetry. But whatever you can do to kind of aggregate all that in one place and know as much as you can about it is a big, first step in the right direction. So if you have functions that are in isolation, in silos that you can't see telemetry for, like that's priority number one. Priority number two, I would say, is a little bit harder problem because it's cultural, right? It's not treating serverless like something that you don't have to follow a process for. And that is including it in things like your regular architecture process and having sort of the paved road, if we want to get into DevOps or DevSecOps concepts, making it easy for teams to adopt your known good best practices. And where that comes into play for me is things like if you're in a regulated space like GDPR, PCI, HIPAA, et cetera, maybe it's a basic change. Like instead of allowing Lambdas to egress to the internet by default, you put them in a VPC that you manage, monitor, and audit from a network perspective, instead of just letting people attach it to anything.
Interesting. Oh, okay. And so to your point, again, to what you said earlier, logging seems to be the key. So you can at least see what's going on. And inventory seems to be key. But is that the same across all CSPs? Because I think the reason I keep going back to the whole CSPs thing, and feel free to kind of say, hey, I mean, you probably focus on one or the other. I don't know how much you've dabbled into the other ones. Maybe you've dabbled only in only a couple. But a lot of people feel serverless was the answer for being, well, I don't know. I don't want to say cloud free, but almost like cloud agnostic. But it's not the case though, right? Because each service provider has their own type of implementation.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a challenge. Like if you're just putting on your software engineer hat for a minute, right, and saying like, oh, I want to write a common business logic set of functions that are going to do some set of processing, right? There is a way to make that cloud agnostic, but it's not that different from making it cloud agnostic for anything, right? Like varying functionality in libraries and like abstracting out the various cloud providers' event formats, those are always going to be the same. And it's going to be the same if you're even considering from a business perspective going between something like EC2 or VMs and Kubernetes and serverless interchangeably. You're going to still build a library in whatever language you're building with a common business object layer. And you're going to want to test that independently of your serverless execution.
Yep.
But you can get it whittled down to this point where the actual event that's coming in, you control relatively rigidly. And you can have a mapping sort of for each cloud provider environment, even though their event formats are relatively different between clouds.
Right. But to your point, the trigger kind, like the kind of triggers you can have between, say, an AWS Lambda versus an Azure function or Google function, would they be similar? Like they're all event driven?
The event paradigm is definitely similar for each one, and certainly the design patterns that your engineering teams are going to use, they're going to be the same as any event-driven architecture, whether you're using like a consumer for a message queue or something like that. Your serverless event pattern, like this idea that you have a single event that has a finite amount of processing that it has to do, it has to assume no state and then exit. Those are going to be the same across all the big clouds.
All right. Okay. So to your point then, so whoever is probably listening to this and maybe working on different cloud providers, but the same principles should still be able to they apply. The kind of way we started this conversation with what are some of the building blocks. Those same building blocks can be applied across any cloud service provider provided serverless function. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, to some degree, certainly, like from a just like a general like classical computer science perspective, also from an architecture perspective, that event pattern is going to be the same. The observability metrics that you're going to want to gather from a security perspective are also going to be the same. So execution time, memory consumption, what logs they're outputting, all that is going to be really, really similar. Just the means that you're going to use to exchange that telemetry is going to be different.
Right. And because you almost, actually, this is a good question coming from Mark KB as well. Actually, we just asked a question about implementation in a typical scenario. So he has a question around, do we have any benchmarks you find for CSPs to start with for Lambda or for serverless functions?
So it gets a little bit complicated when we start to talk about benchmarks, because this is like evolving, right? So I think that there's compliance packs in AWS, for example, that if you apply them, they'll address like specific sets of compliance regs for HIPAA or PCI, but I don't think there's anything universal.
No, I think, Chen, maybe what's I calling out, Cloud Security Alliance came up with a white paper recently. You and I are part of a CNCF white paper as well, which you can hopefully release soon for the world for serverless security white paper. But I think until that comes across, I also don't know of any other benchmarking, because I don't know if this is CIS benchmark. But I think, what are your thoughts on the whole attack metrics thing for, how for serverless as well? Because a lot of people kind of normally lean there for building a threat model exercise for a serverless function to what maybe kind of was going with this. We did the whole, let's do an asset inventory. We identified all the functions that we have. Now let's start doing a threat model analysis. And usually at that point, people lean over for something like an attack meter for that. And I don't know if there's a good one for serverless, unless you know of one.
So I like to start with the SaaS top 10 when I talk about serverless attacks. So a long time ago, PureSec and Twistlock, I believe, teamed up with OWASP, and they created the SaaS top 10, similar to the OWASP top 10 for serverless stuff. And it just sort of enumerates a bunch of popular potential attacks that apply to all the different CSPs. That's a great place to start. It's a great place to start if you're doing threat modeling. I have a cat.
Hey, what's the cat's name?
This is Donna.
Hi, Donna. Welcome to the show, Donna. Do you like coffee as well?
It does. So this SaaS list is a great place to start that's provider independent. So it starts with function data injection, so like mangling the event itself to get something unintended, broken authentication, so overly permissive IAM, or in the case of API gateway, for example, you might have a function that authorizes another function that has an authentication bypass. That's not unique to serverless, right? Like we see that all the time, like UT stuff.
Yeah, that's like a WebT,
This is the classic example I like to give, where you send the JWT with the algorithm as none. So it just doesn't get verified by the underlying library. Insecure serverless deployment configurations, so potential pivots, overprivileged permissions, inadequate monitoring and logging. We talked to death about that just a minute ago. Insecure dependencies, like a supply chain problem. This is not a problem that's unique to serverless, but it still does apply. Insecure secret storage definitely applies. People constantly with Lambda functions and Azure functions and Google Cloud functions, they put sensitive things in environment variables. And that's, it's not any different than Kubernetes, right? Or
that's right.
EC2, it just still applies here. Denial of service and financial resource exhaustion, which is that's part of a threat model I think a lot of people don't think of very often. And they also
that's a denial of wallet. That's a denial of wallet as well, right?
Yeah. They don't use the flip side of that to justify their security strategy either, because serverless, believe it or not, it's often sold as like, oh my gosh, you're going to save so much money, but it can also be really expensive if you apply the technology incorrectly.
Yeah. For people who've paid thousands of dollars and experienced a denial of wallet, we're definitely vouch for that as well. So, I'll probably put a link for that in the show notes as well for people to kind of go back to as well then. So, we have a model to go back to for SaaS top 10 as a benchmark for people to kind of go and find out what they can do from an the threat modeling perspective. I'm curious about the skill set as well in the team, Because do we need AppSec people in the team to be able to do security for a serverless? I mean, and bearing in mind that all of us who are probably listening to this as well are trying to do some form of cloud security. Not all of us are AppSec people. A lot of us started network security, picked up cloud security, and they're like, oh, I can do like software composition analysis. That's not bad. That's kind of like patching, so I can grab onto that. But static code analysis, and I feel like DAS, SAS, and stuff, that's like very AppSec. So it feels like there's a skill set of the team for people who may have like a cloud security team. Does that need to expand into AppSec as well? Or I'm curious on your thoughts. What kind of skill set should people look at in their team for doing serverless security?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to chew on there. Even until very recently, I think if you had said like SAST and DAST are part of AppSec, I would have said like, oh, it's probably not, because those were like very computer sciencey, like very academic concepts that we're only seeing now like sort of trickle into our industry. So like first and foremost, I would say to people, if you're uncomfortable with those things, don't be afraid of them and just go and try and use the tools that are out there, because the difference between you and somebody who says I'm an expert at is probably like this big, right? Because the technology has existed for so long, or yet such a short period of time, that if somebody does say, oh, I'm an expert at XYZ, unless they published a thesis on it, they're probably not any more of an expert than you, really.
No, yeah, that's true. That's a good point, by the way. Because to your point, the SAS test, and by the way, I'm curious to know your thought on this, but I definitely don't recommend people start with SAS first, because it just the number of false positives you get. I normally tell people to go for SCAs, like software composition analysis, find the libraries and stuff first before they go into SAS. But I don't know, do you normally recommend people go SCA, or do you recommend people go SAS first? What are your thoughts on those?
So there's a whole bunch of factors there, I think, that dictate the practicality of your strategy. Like one, again, is the initial threat model or risk assessment. The other is the language writing in and the tooling support for that. So like, for example, I'm a big fan of R2C SemGrep, for example, if you've ever heard.
Oh my God, yes. AST is the world.
Huge. It provides so much value as far as like analysis, static analysis pre-production. At the same time, I don't think it's a question of anymore like whether we need SCA or DAST, like dynamic analysis, like in the runtime itself. I think we really need both to be able to detect all the different sorts of attack vectors that we're going to see. And for me, that's like acceptance. So if you're a fan of Kelly Shortridge, and I reference this a lot, Kelly Shortridge has this talk on the stages of InfoSec brief, like where you get to the acceptance stage, which really just means that you need both of those kind of detection mechanisms and controls. So you need detection in the runtime itself, and you need static analysis.
Interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned it. So from a skill set perspective, then sounds like we definitely need a few AppSec folks in the team then to be able to kind of do at least a full scale serverless security, and depending on how many Lambda functions you have, actually. Maybe do you feel like there's a maturity scale where the initial step, if you don't have an AppSec person or probably don't have a budget for an AppSec person, at least the initial thing would be to get an asset inventory or get a viewpoint of at least all the cloud security components? Where do people start there?
So my answer depends on the size of your company and the size and complexity of your organization, right? I think that there's still huge dividends paid in not just hiring that one AppSec person that's going to come in and do your inventory, but hiring somebody who's going to do that and then kickstart a embedding or a security champions program to try and create an education campaign for your existing teams and build that into sort of the team set of OKRs or goals for a quarter or whatever. So you're not just creating another silo, you're sort of like farming out little bits of security as you have tooling and observability to do that. And I think that's where the big force multiplier is.
And so that's how you can scale as well at that point. Do we need to build a security champions program for this as well, for serverless security?
So serverless security, I still say is just security. In fact, it's actually easier in a lot of ways, I think, because there's a finite set of possibilities based on platform, right? So we can really take the set of potential outcomes and we can really, really limit the threat model. And I think that's what makes serverless compelling and interesting, because it is easier to secure.
Yep, and I think that's a good note to kind of come towards the end. So unless you have people, feel free to drop any questions you have. But I think that was pretty valuable, man. But we do have towards the end, we do a fun section so people get to know the other side of you as well. Especially now, since we're going into like next weekend being Thanksgiving weekend, I definitely wanted people to know a bit more about the personal side of the coffee connoisseur that Andrew is as well, I guess. So I've only got 3 questions, not too many. And I'll probably start with the first one. What do you spend most time on when you're not working on cloud security or technology?
So I like to get outside. I have a very small-ish alfalfa farm in this part of the state. I have horses, and so I spend most of my time dragging sprinklers around and driving tractors.
Tractors, horses, and in a farm. That would definitely keep you busy, man. I think I don't know if I can do that with horses. Do you ride horses? I'm assuming then, if you have horses.
Yeah, I do ride them. They're very expensive to have as a pet if you're not using them for some sort of activity.
Oh, okay. I would probably keep that a note of it. For parents who are listening to this, going, if their kids want a pony in the house, so it's just an expensive one to have, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, my horses, when I was competing, they had massage therapist, acupuncture, dentist, horseshoer. You know, it's like
what for a horse?
Oh yeah, the horses get better care than I do.
A massage therapist for a horse.
Oh yeah, it's super important. I mean, if you think about the size of the relative muscle groups and things, you know, if you're really doing a lot of vigorous physical activity, you know, they get muscle knots, you know, just like everybody else.
Wow. Okay. Actually, we might take now that's kind of come to an interesting point, but we have a couple of questions that came in, so I might very quickly answer those as well. And we flick back to the final 2 questions of the fun section. I've got a first question from Chad. When enforcing various security controls and features, are there any common mistakes to watch out for that could drastically affect end user experience or performance?
So the answer would be everything. Depending on where you're putting your instrumentation, right? So like X-ray is a really great example where they just have a library that you can pull in where you can actually say just patch all the functions and instrument tracing on all of them. If you do that, you're going to take a performance hit, right? Same thing if you're building an aggressive logging or things that are locking. Like if it's like Python, for example, is a great example because it doesn't have awesome parallelism. The more that you instrument, the more you're going to have to think about concurrency and kind of fan out. So again, just having that observability and tracing so that you can know when you put things into your stack, how much you have to scale, really, really important.
Interesting. So to your point then, for having an effective serverless security control, it probably goes back to your point about the basics with having a balance between, hey, what control is really important versus without compromising on performance, and maybe working with the developers or whoever's producing that for that.
Yeah, I always tell people start with a list of 5 things that you would never want to have happen. Find a way to enforce that first, and then start to do continuous improvement on that until you reach a point of diminishing returns. Then start to look at other things, because there's definitely always some low-hanging fruit like the network and the IAM.
Yeah. That's a good point, because I wonder how many people have top 5 that they consider. Because depending on how many applications you're looking at in a company, top 5 could vary. So there's already a lot of pile of work right there. So hopefully that answered your question, Chad. But feel free to ask a follow-up question. Another one from RKB. Do you have any examples of serverless breaches, or can we deep dive a little into any of it?
So I don't know, and people always ask me this when I talk about serverless, is if there's a public serverless breach that I could deep dive on. I don't know of any that have actually made news headlines, and that's also kind of an interesting artifact here, that as we talk about this, and a lot of people have sort of redone the same research that I did in 2017 as security conference talks. I haven't seen a presentation yet that cited a famous breach or had a story of their own breach.
Oh, actually, a good point. And maybe worthwhile calling out, because a lot of the serverless security training that takes place, that kind of revolves around the area of the kind of exactly what you mentioned with container, potentially a container running in the background, having something persistent, or access to something persistent, and then be able to exploit that. I think, but beyond that, there is no public reference of what else people have done. I mean, I guess you can go into aspects connected to your serverless function, and maybe they are breached or they're vulnerable, but there's a lot of gray area. But I also have not heard of a public one yet. But no, in saying that, it doesn't mean that people may have just not have shared it.
I'm sure there's some ancillary breaches that had serverless as a component, like a secret leak or an SSRF that resulted in a credential leak or something. We just didn't see serverless front and center as kind of the star of the show there.
Yeah.
Like oftentimes, like Kubernetes gets called out because of the admin interface, and there's like kube secrets or something. We just haven't really seen that on Hacker News or Reddit yet.
No, definitely not yet. But I think it'll be. Although, do you feel like that's far away, or maybe to your point, we've already seen it, but because serverless was not given the starlight on it, it wasn't even given paid attention. But somewhere, some of those questions, because the trainings that I have done in the past for my team, where we went for, like, at Black Hat, they do serverless security training as well. I think, I did not know if they did last year, but a few years ago, they did a serverless security training. And the exercises, from what I understand from my team, was they have a Lambda function, which is rendering a web page. And then you use that to go to, say, one of the metadata URLs for AWS or Azure or whatever. And you're able to kind of like redo a recon and get more information about what the environment is, and use that to go into other resources that you have access to. Like, that's a common one. I don't know if you've seen any other ones.
Yeah, the other one that I think I would call out is the authentication bypass, because oftentimes people will use this authentication proxy pattern. So they use a function in front of a function. So we see that commonly in API gateway, where there is like a potential authentication bypass just by doing header fuzzing or something along those lines. And then you can get to the subsequent protected function. Those tend to be fun ones.
Oh, actually, that's a good one as well. I'm going to make a note for that one. Cool. All right. Hopefully we answered your question, RKB. Thanks so much for that. Thanks so much for that. And feel free to drop another one if you like. But coming back to the fun section again. So we spoke about horses and massage therapists for horses. It's a very extreme tangent to go from serverless security to a massage therapist for a horse. And Donna's back again. So the second question that I have for you is, what is something that you're proud of but is not on your social media?
Oh, I mean, there's a bunch of things. I guess I could cite, like, my farm is definitely like one of the things I don't social media about, but we already talked about that. But I also do saxophone performance.
Wait, no way! You can play saxophone?
Yeah, kind of in secret.
Oh wait, is there even a thing like the bathroom saxophone player?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of great spaces that are great to play saxophone, but. So you can play it well, I'm assuming. That's why it makes you happy. Yeah, studied saxophone in college. So like my first big kid job ever, when I graduated with my computer science degree, was sysadmin for the college that I went to, and they had a program where you could go, basically, if you were an employee, take classes for free. So I was like, I want to get like saxophone lesson.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll look forward to a day when I can hear the saxophone in person as well, then, man. Cool. Last question. What is your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share?
Oh, my favorite cuisine or restaurant is definitely my house. I love to cook at home. I've done every cooking masterclass on masterclass.com, I think, like the Wolfgang Puck ones, the Gordon Ramsay ones.
Yep.
Aside from that, there's a Mexican restaurant down the road that I love. It's called Comal Bar and Grill, and they just make the best Guatemalan Mexican fusion food that you've ever had. It's so good.
Interesting. And wait, so to your point, you had the whole farm to table experience because you have. I'm assuming you're growing vegetables and stuff on your farm as well.
Yeah, I have about a 1 acre garden.
Oh wow! So okay, yeah, totally a farm to well, no, you don't have to go to a restaurant, man. So when you have a farm to table experience at your house or at your farm, in this case, you definitely don't need to do any of that. That's definitely not required. I think for people like us who are not in the farm, we have to go pay high dollar value for farm to table.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just every day for me. I do a lot of pressure canning. Like I do the whole thing, like put up tomatoes, like vacuum pack things, like freeze the. I had 30 tomato plants this year, generating like 200 pounds of tomatoes per week or something crazy like that. So
Interesting.
it was a great year.
Wow. What do you do with all that tomato?
Freeze them or give them away, like make up boxes, give them to the neighborhood.
I'm like, wow, that's a lot of tomatoes for you. And well, I don't think Donna can have it, but I think just. But it's so no. I definitely need to sort of take some tips on farming from you. Then in that case, definitely need to get a massage therapist for myself. I should have just been born as a horse instead of a man. I feel like, believe it or not, I had so many. What was it again? Massage therapist, horseshoe person,
Acupuncture,
and
a dentist.
Oh my God! Like so jealous of a horse right now. like I would definitely be a horse any day. Probably a horse race, I guess. But but that was that was the conclusion. I can go into a very different rabbit hole. Someone else came in as well. Hey, Marv, I'm new to the space, but both of you are awesome. Really great content and wealth of knowledge here. I will follow for you. Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, I totally agree, Mama. RKB, thanks, man. So that's pretty much what we have the time for. So thank you so much for spending the time with us, man. I think I definitely feel I can bring you back again after your reinvent talk, because I definitely want to talk about merger and acquisition and how to do security at scale for after merger acquisition. So maybe I can bring both you and Nathan for that after you guys are done with the talk. So to people who want to reach out to you, maybe have some follow-up questions about security, where can they find you? Where do you hang around on social medias of the world?
Yeah, so I'm just Andrew Krug, Krug is the last name if you don't know how to spell Krug, on Twitter. And also you can find my email and phone number on my personal website, andrewkrug.com. I'm also hiring at Datadog like crazy for security advocate and security evangelists. If you're interested in doing the kind of work that I do, presentations, blogs, prototypes, security research, definitely reach out to me. I'm always happy to have a conversation, even if you don't think your background is the right fit. The requirements are suggestions, not hard rules. So yeah, reach out to me.
Cool. Or maybe what's I talking if you're there, what are the security cloud security evangelists do can be a good question for people to ask you as well if they're looking for a icebreaker to talk to you. So that could be a good one to start off as well. But thanks so much for coming in, man. I really appreciate this time, and I am looking forward to hopefully bringing you and Nathan together for another couple of conversations. But for everyone else, thank you for joining us. And this was the second last episode for the season, and we are hopefully everyone enjoys the next Thanksgiving. I think we're still contemplating if we should have another episode, considering it's Thanksgiving weekend next weekend. But thanks everyone for coming in, and we will see you soon. Thank you. Peace.